Every day, a young woman who ran a small roadside food shop in Chicago gave a homeless little boy free meals. She never asked for anything in return. She did not know his story. She did not know who his parents were. But one quiet morning, something strange happened. Four black SUVs pulled up right in front of her shop. Men in dark suits stepped out, their eyes scanning the street like predators. And then a powerful man emerged from the last vehicle, a man whose name was whispered in fear across the city. Her whole life changed in a way she never expected. Who was this dangerous man? And what was the little boy's true connection to him? Sit back and find out as we delve into this touching story. If this story touched your heart, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another story. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one. In a shadowed corner of Chicago's South Side, where sunlight seldom managed to reach, a 6-year-old boy lay curled tight on a thin blanket. His name was Ethan. The place he lived in was not truly a room. It was only a corner of an unfinished building with cold concrete walls and window openings left without glass. A hard wind pushed in from outside, carrying the biting chill of early morning that seemed to slice through skin and bone. Ethan opened his eyes before dawn had the chance to show itself. His eyes were still swollen and reamed from too little sleep, but he didn't dare close them again. He knew he had to get up early. He knew there was work he had to do. Slowly, he sat up, careful not to make a sound. He looked to the side to where his mother lay. Sarah, Ethan's mother, lay motionless on a worn-out mattress. Her face was frighteningly pale. Her lips were dry and cracked. Her breathing was heavy, strained, as though each breath was a battle she had to fight and win. Ethan stared at her, and pain cut through him like a blade. A 6-year-old boy didn't understand illness in full. But he knew his mother was very weak. He knew she needed medicine, needed a doctor, needed so many things he could not possibly provide. But there was one thing he could do. He could find food. Ethan whispered to himself so softly, it was almost nothing at all. Today, I have to find food. Mom has to eat. He got to his feet and moved quietly to her side. He knelt down and looked at the face of the woman who had brought him into the world. Even thin, even pallid, even sick, to Ethan, she was still the most beautiful person on earth. Sarah seemed to sense her son's presence. She tried to open her eyes, though her lids were heavy as lead. When she saw Ethan, she forced a smile. It was a fragile smile, but it held all the love a mother could carry. Ethan, she whispered, her voice rough and horsero. Be careful. Okay. Come back early, sweetheart. Ethan nodded, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. I'll be careful, Mom. I promise. He took her hand. It was so thin, so cold, all bone and sharp angles. He held it tightly, as if he could press warmth from his small body into hers. A few seconds passed in silence. Then, slowly, Ethan let go. He knew he had to leave. He knew that if he didn't go early, he wouldn't find anything. He stood and walked toward the way out. He didn't look back because he was afraid that if he did, he wouldn't have the courage to go. But Sarah watched him. Her eyes followed the small figure of his back until he disappeared behind the concrete wall. Tears slid quietly down her hollow cheeks. She felt powerless. She felt guilty. She was the mother. She was supposed to protect her child, to care for him, to make sure he was safe. But now her 6-year-old son had to go out there into a cruel world just to find a scrap of food for her. Sarah closed her eyes, her lips moving as if in prayer. Please protect my son. Please let my boy be safe. Outside, Ethan walked on in the dim light of early morning. A 6-year-old boy with narrow shoulders and old torn clothes, barefoot on the cold ground. But there was something in his eyes. A kind of light. The light of determination. The light of love for his mother. Today he would find food. Today his mother would not go hungry. No matter how cruel the world might be, Ethan would not give up. But life hadn't always been this hard. 7 years earlier, everything had been completely different. Back then, Sarah was 25, a beautiful young woman with a radiant smile and eyes full of hope. She owned a small bakery in downtown Chicago where she baked fragrant pastries with her own hands every day. The bakery wasn't big, but it was cozy, always filled with the scent of vanilla, the richness of butter, the quiet sweetness of happiness. It was everything Sarah needed, a job she loved, a peaceful life, and dreams that reached forward into the future. Then one day, Nathan appeared. He walked into Sarah's bakery on an autumn afternoon, tall and handsome, with black hair and deep-set eyes that held something mysterious. He wore a black suit and carried an air of elegance and power Sarah had never seen in any customer before. Nathan ordered a chocolate cake and a cup of black coffee. He sat in the corner watching Sarah work with an intent, unblinking focus. When Sarah brought the cake to him, he smiled. That smile made her heart skip a beat. She asked what he did for a living. He said he was a businessman. Just that. No further explanation, no clear details. And Sarah didn't press. She was drawn to the mystery of him. From then on, Nathan came to the bakery every day. They talked, they laughed, and little by little, they grew close. Nathan told Sarah about his travels, about the cities he had visited. Sarah told Nathan about her dream of expanding the bakery, about the simple life she loved. Love blossomed between them like spring flowers. Nathan took Sarah to dinner at elegant restaurants. He gave her red roses every week. He looked at her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. Sarah had never been loved like that. She was so happy that sometimes she wondered if it was all a dream, but there were strange things Sarah tried to ignore. Nathan always had people trailing him. Big men in black suits stood outside the bakery every time he came. His phone rang constantly, and whenever he answered it, he stepped outside to speak in a low, controlled voice. Sometimes he vanished for days without explanation. But when he returned, he always held Sarah tight, as if he were afraid of losing her. Sarah loved Nathan too much to question him. She told herself he was a busy businessman. She told herself everyone had secrets. She told herself that as long as they loved each other, everything would be all right. Then one night, Nathan came to the bakery with a grave expression. He took Sarah's hand and looked straight into her eyes. "Sarah," he said, his voice deep and heavy with worry. "I have enemies, dangerous people. I need to go take care of something important." Sarah felt as though her heart were being squeezed shut. She asked what kind of enemies. Nathan was silent for a moment, then said they were the kind of enemies she didn't want to know about, but he promised he would come back. He promised her. That night, Nathan said he needed money to resolve the problem. He didn't say exactly how much, and he didn't say what it was for, but Sarah didn't hesitate. She gave him all her savings. The money she had set aside over years to expand the bakery. She gave it to him because she loved him. She gave it to him because she believed him. Nathan held Sarah for a long time before he left. He kissed her forehead and whispered that he loved her, that he would come back, that they would have a future together. For the first 2 weeks, Nathan called Sarah every day. He said he missed her. He said things were almost finished. He said he only needed a little more time. Sarah waited, counting every day, every hour. Then abruptly, every call stopped. Sarah called Nathan and no one answered. She called again and still no one answered. She called dozens of times, hundreds of times. The phone rang and then went silent. Sarah didn't understand what was happening. She cried. She prayed. She waited. But Nathan didn't return. Not a single explanation, not a single message, nothing at all. For weeks after Nathan disappeared, Sarah began to feel her body changing. She felt nauseated every morning. She was tired in a way that didn't make sense. She went to the hospital and the doctor told her something she never expected. She was pregnant. Sarah sat frozen in the exam room, her hand trembling as it rested on her stomach. She was carrying Nathan's child, the man who had abandoned her, the man who had vanished without a single goodbye. She could have chosen not to keep the baby. But Sarah didn't. She decided to keep this child. This was her own flesh and blood. This was proof of her love. Even if that love had betrayed her. 9 months later, Sarah gave birth to a healthy baby boy. She named him Ethan, a name that meant strong and enduring. She held her son in her arms, tears streaming down her face, and swore she would do everything to protect him, even if she had to do it alone. Even without Nathan, even if the whole world turned its back on her. In the first years after Ethan was born, Sarah's life was difficult, but it was still full of happiness. She worked at the bakery and cared for her little boy at the same time. Every day was exhausting. Every night came with too little sleep. Yet, whenever she saw Ethan smile, Sarah felt it was all worth it. Ethan grew day by day, healthy and sweet. He had eyes exactly like his father's, deep and intelligent. He began preschool, began making friends, began discovering the world around him. Sarah worked relentlessly to pay for his schooling, to buy him new clothes, to give him the best life she possibly could. Even without a father, Ethan still had his mother. And for Sarah, as long as the two of them were together, it was enough. But fate didn't allow them to stay steady for long. 2 years earlier, when Ethan had just turned 4, Sarah began to feel that something in her body wasn't right. She was unusually tired, drained even when she had slept enough. Her legs swelled every evening. A dull ache settled in her abdomen for no clear reason. Sometimes she grew so dizzy she nearly fell while working in the bakery. Sarah tried to ignore the symptoms. She told herself she was simply overwork. She told herself that if she rested a little, she'd feel better. But things only worsened. One morning, Sarah tried to stand to get Ethan a drink of water, but her legs wouldn't obey. She staggered, nearly falling. Ethan ran to her and clutched at her shirt with his tiny hands. He asked if she was okay, his eyes filled with worry. Sarah forced a reassuring smile for him, but inside she knew something serious was happening. She went to the hospital. After many tests, the doctor sat down across from her with a grave expression. The doctor said Sarah had end-stage kidney failure. She needed a kidney transplant to live. While she waited to find a suitable match, she would have to undergo dialysis twice a week. The cost of treatment was enormous and could reach into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Sarah sat stunned in the exam room, tears pouring down her face. She asked what would happen if she didn't receive treatment. The doctor was silent for a moment, then said she wouldn't have much time. Sarah returned home in a state that felt like her soul had been emptied out, but she didn't have time to collapse. She still had Ethan. She couldn't die. She had to live for her child. Sarah began selling everything she owned. First went the bakery, the work she had loved for so many years. Then the belongings in their home, from the television to the refrigerator, from the table and chairs to the bed they slept on. She sold it all to pay for dialysis, for medication, for hospital bills, but the money kept slipping through her fingers and her condition didn't improve. When her savings ran dry, Sarah could no longer afford to pay for Ethan's school. The little boy had to stop attending. On his last day, Ethan clung to his mother and sobbed. He asked why he couldn't go to school anymore. Sarah could only hold him and say she was sorry. She was so very sorry. Then came the day they could no longer pay rent. The landlord knocked on the door and handed Sarah a notice. She had 3 days to leave. Sarah stood in the small apartment and looked around at the familiar walls. The place she had lived for so many years, the place where Ethan had grown up. Now she had to walk away from it. On the day they moved out, Sarah had only a small bag with a few changes of clothes. She lifted Ethan into her arms and stepped out of the apartment for the last time. Her tears wouldn't stop falling. She whispered into her son's ear. "I'm sorry, Ethan. I'm so sorry." Ethan wrapped his arms tightly around her neck, his small voice quiet but startlingly steady. "It's okay, Mom. As long as we have each other, that's enough." Those words from a 4-year-old shattered Sarah's heart. They wandered the streets, not knowing where to go. In the end, they found a corner inside an unfinished building on the south side. It was dark, cold, filthy, but at least it gave them shelter from rain and sun. Sarah cleaned that small corner, laid down an old mattress she'd found on the street, and turned it into the new home for mother and son. From then on, Sarah's illness grew worse and worse because she no longer had the money to keep up with regular dialysis. And Ethan, a 6-year-old child, had to step out into the world every day, face its cruelty, and beg for scraps of food to feed his mother. And that was how every day for Ethan began. A 6-year-old boy walking the streets of the South Side where the harshest version of Chicago life showed itself without apology. Cars thundered past him, roaring close at his side. Pedestrians hurried by without so much as a glance. Ethan was small in the rush of bodies, like an invisible grain of sand in a vast desert. He walked slowly, his eyes scanning everything around him, searching for faces that looked kind. His stomach had already tightened and churned with hunger, but he didn't think of himself. He thought only of his mother. Lying alone in that cold place, weak, needing food. Ethan spotted a middle-aged woman standing near the curb, a luxurious handbag hanging from her arm. He gathered every ounce of courage and stepped toward her. He looked up at her with clear, unguarded eyes, and his small voice rose carefully into the air. "Ma'am, please help me." The woman looked down at Ethan. Her gaze swept over his torn old clothes, over his dirty bare feet, over the thinness of his face. Then she turned away and walked on as if he didn't exist. Not a single word, not a single compassionate look. Only coldness and indifference. Ethan stood there and something sharp pierced his small heart. But he didn't cry. He told himself maybe she was in a hurry. Maybe she hadn't heard him. He would try again. He saw a man buying a newspaper at a street stand. Ethan hurried over and stood in front of him. "Sir, please. I'm so hungry." The man frowned and waved a hand at Ethan as if shooing away an annoying fly. He didn't even bother to look the boy in the face, only muttered something under his breath and walked away. Ethan was left alone again. The little boy didn't lose heart. He kept trying. An elderly woman was out for a walk and he approached to ask for help. She shook her head and said she had nothing. A young man was listening to music and Ethan stood in front of him. The man pulled out an earbud, looked at Ethan with irritation, then walked off without a word. A couple walked by hand in hand, and Ethan called out. They looked at him with suspicion, as if he were a scammer, and quickly hurried on. And so Ethan tried one person after another. Some ignored him completely. Some looked at him with pity, but still did nothing. Some even scolded him, telling him to go somewhere else, to stop bothering people. Each time he was refused, Ethan's heart hurt a little more. A 6-year-old boy couldn't understand why the world was so cold. He couldn't understand why no one would help him, even though he was only asking for a small bite of food. But Ethan didn't cry. He bit down hard on his lip, swallowing the tears that threatened to spill. He wasn't allowed to cry. He had to be strong. His mother was waiting. His mother needed him. He stopped at the edge of the road and lifted his face toward Chicago's gray sky. He whispered to himself, like a reminder, like a source of strength. Mom needs to eat. I have to find something. I can't give up. Ethan raised the back of his hand and wiped at his burning eyes. He drew a deep breath, trying to steady himself. Then he walked on. His small feet kept moving along the endless road. He didn't know where he would end up. He didn't know whether anyone would help him. But he knew one thing with certainty. He would not stop. For his mother, he would never stop. Ethan kept walking like that. For who knew how long? His small feet ached with exhaustion. His hunger gnawed at him, but he still didn't stop. Then all at once, a familiar scent drifted through the air. The smell of food, the smell of hot rice, the rich, savory aroma of braised chicken, the bright herbal fragrance of vegetable soup rising with steam. Ethan stopped and drew in a deep breath. His stomach growled loudly, as if protesting how long it had been left empty. He looked around, trying to find where the scent was coming from, and then he saw it. A small Heir sat by the roadside. It wasn't large, only a few simple tables and chairs, but it looked clean and warm on a wooden sign hanging by the door. A rustic line of handwritten letters read Grace's kitchen. Smoke curled up from the kitchen and back, carrying the irresistible perfume of fresh hot food. Ethan stood there, staring into the restaurant. He saw customers eating, plates heaped high, bowls of soup sending up gentle steam. His throat tightened. He wanted to step inside and ask for a bite, but he had been turned away too many times that day. He was afraid. He didn't dare. Instead of going in, Ethan quietly sat down on a small wooden chair placed outside. He sat with his hands on his knees, his eyes lowered to the ground. He didn't ask. He didn't speak. He simply sat and waited. Waiting for what? He didn't even know. Perhaps he was waiting for a miracle. Inside, Grace Turner was busy with her work. She was 27, the owner of this little restaurant. The place wasn't crowded, only busy enough to let her scrape by, but it was everything she had, the result of years of saving and labor. Grace had been orphaned as a child and raised in foster care. When she turned 18, she left and stepped into the world with nothing but her own 2 hands. She did every kind of job, from washing dishes to serving tables, from cleaning floors to cooking meals. She saved every dollar, every cent for years on end. And at last, she opened this small restaurant. Grace had a dream. She wanted to go to college. She wanted a better future. But rent kept rising. The cost of living kept climbing, and her dream drifted farther away. Even so, she never stopped hoping. Every day she worked hard, served customers with a smile, and told herself that one day things would be better. That day, after the late morning rush eased, Grace stood at the window washing dishes. By chance, she glanced outside, and her eyes caught on something that made her pause. A little boy was sitting on the wooden chair outside the restaurant. He was thin, wearing torn old clothes, barefoot. He sat there alone with his head bowed, looking so small, so painfully pitiable. Grace set the dish down. She watched him for a long time. Her heart tightened. She remembered the days when she was little. The days when she too had been hungry, when she too had been alone, when she too had sat by herself with no one paying attention. Grace wiped her hands on her apron and stepped out of the restaurant. She walked over to the boy, then slowly sat down, bending so she was at eye level with him. She offered a truly warm smile. "Hello there, my name is Grace. What's your name?" Ethan lifted his head, startled that someone was speaking to him. He looked into the woman's eyes. They were warm and gentle with none of the coldness or indifference he had met on the street. He answered softly. "My name is Ethan, ma'am." Grace smiled. "Ethan, are you hungry?" Ethan bit his lip, hesitating. Then he nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I'm very hungry, but I don't have any money." Grace reached out and gently smoothed the boy's messy hair. "That's okay. Come inside. I'll feed you." Ethan's eyes went wide as if he couldn't trust what he'd just heard. He looked at Grace, searching for any sign of a trick, any hint of mockery, but he saw only sincerity. The boy stood up and followed her inside timidly. Grace led Ethan to a small table in the corner. She told him to sit and wait, then disappeared into the kitchen. A few minutes later, she returned with a plate piled high, hot white rice, fragrant braised chicken, bright green stir-fried vegetables, and a steaming bowl of soup. Ethan stared at the meal, tears rising fast. It had been so long since he had even seen food like this. He picked up his chopsticks and began to eat. He ate quickly, desperately, as if he were afraid someone might snatch the plate away. Grace stood watching, her chest full of aching pity. She didn't say anything, only quietly poured him a glass of water. When Ethan finished, he set his chopsticks down. He looked up at Grace with eyes full of gratitude, but instead of saying thank you, he asked a question that made Grace freeze. "Ma'am, could I please ask for another serving to take home for my mom?" Grace looked at the boy, and it felt as if someone had tightened a fist around her heart. A 6-year-old child hungry enough to eat as if he were starving, and the first thing he thought about wasn't himself, but his mother. Grace nodded, her voice trembling slightly. Of course, sweetheart, just wait a moment. She went back into the kitchen and prepared a generous portion with her own hands. She packed it carefully into a container, then brought it out and placed it in Ethan's arms. The boy took it and held it tight against his chest as if it were the most precious treasure in the world. Thank you. Thank you so much, ma'am. Grace watched Ethan run off, his small back disappearing around the corner of the street. She stood there for a long time, her mind heavy with thought. She didn't know who the boy was or what his story might be. But she knew one thing. If he came back tomorrow, she would feed him again. And the day after that, and the day after that, because it was the right thing to do, just as Grace had thought. The next day, Ethan came back. The boy appeared at the doorway early in the morning, his eyes timid as they peered inside. Grace was already waiting. She lifted her hand and waved him in, smiling as if she were welcoming an old friend. From that day on, Ethan came to Grace's place every day. Each morning, the little boy would appear, sit at the small table in the corner, and Grace would bring out a plate of hot rice. She never asked for money. She never showed irritation. She simply fed him, then packed an extra portion for him to take back to his mother. Over those meetings, Grace and Ethan slowly grew close. At first, the boy was shy and quiet. But little by little, he opened up. He told Grace about his mother, about how she was seriously ill and couldn't work. About how they had to leave their old apartment because they had no money. About how he couldn't go to school anymore, about how he had no father. Grace listened, and it felt as if her heart were being cut to pieces. She didn't press him with questions, not wanting to drag him back through the sorrow. But every fragment Ethan shared made her worry deepen. A 6-year-old child and a gravely ill mother living with no one to care for them. How were they surviving? One day after Ethan finished eating and was about to leave, Grace called him back. She looked at the boy, her voice gentle but sincere. Ethan, could you take me to meet your mom? Ethan was startled, his eyes wide as he stared at Grace. He was silent for a moment, as if thinking it through. Then he nodded. Yes, ma'am. But my home is very far, and it isn't nice. Grace smiled and patted his head. That's okay. I want to meet your mom. Grace closed the restaurant earlier than usual. She prepared 2 generous portions of food, packed them carefully into a bag, and then followed Ethan. The boy led her through crowded streets, through dark alleys, deeper into the south side. The farther they went, the poorer and more desolate everything became. Old buildings, walls split with cracks, piles of trash heaped into the corners of the street. Grace felt her worry rising, but she kept walking. At last, Ethan stopped in front of an unfinished building. It had no doors, no windows, only bare concrete walls and rusted steel frames. It looked like an abandoned ruin, not a place where anyone could live. Ethan spoke softly. My home is in here. Grace stood frozen, unable to believe what she was seeing. She followed Ethan inside. Cold, damp air rushed at her face. Weak light slipped in through window openings without glass. The ground was littered with broken bricks and garbage. Ethan led her down a dark corridor, then stopped at a small corner blocked off by old tarps. This was the home he shared with his mother. Grace stepped in, and it felt as if her heart shattered into 100 pieces. On a filthy, worn-out mattress lay a woman. She was so thin that her ribs showed clearly beneath her thin clothing. Her face was pallid, her lips cracked and dry, her eyes sunken deep. Her breathing was heavy and difficult as though every breath were a struggle against death itself. This was Sarah, Ethan's mother. Ethan ran to her side and gently shook her. Mom, Grace came to visit you. She's the one who feeds me every day. Sarah tried to open her eyes. When she saw Grace standing there, she attempted to sit up, but her body was too weak to allow it. Tears began to spill down her cheeks. Are you Grace? She asked, her voice rough and hoarse. Thank you. Thank you for feeding my son. I don't know what to say. I owe you so much. Grace knelt beside Sarah and took her bony hand in her own. Tears began to fall from Grace's eyes as well. Please don't say that. I'm only doing what I should do. From now on, I'll help you and Ethan. I'll bring food every day. You just focus on getting better. Sarah sobbed, gripping Grace's hand as if it were a lifeline in a vast sea. 2 women, 2 different lives, meeting in the most painful of circumstances. And yet between them, a bond began to form, a bond of human kindness, of compassion, of hope. From that day on, Grace didn't only feed Ethan at the restaurant. Every evening after she closed, she carried a bag of food and walked to the unfinished building, bringing meals for both mother and son. She brought medicine, too, and warm blankets and small necessities she could afford with the little money she had. Grace knew she couldn't change their situation. She knew Sarah needed more than food and medicine, but she did what she could because it was the right thing to do. Because she couldn't turn away from someone else's suffering. But no matter how hard Grace tried, Sarah's condition still didn't improve. Food could keep her from starving, but it couldn't heal kidneys that had already failed. Sarah needed dialysis twice a week to stay alive. But she had no money left. She had missed too many sessions, and her body was slowly breaking down. With each passing day, Sarah grew a little weaker. She no longer had the strength to sit up. She no longer had the strength to talk much with Ethan. Sometimes she simply lay there, breathing with difficulty, her eyes tightly closed, as if she were slipping into a long sleep with no end. Ethan watched his mother every day, his chest filled with worry. A 6-year-old boy didn't understand illness, but he knew his mother was very weak. He knew she was in pain. He knew something very bad was happening. Then that morning came. Ethan woke as he always did before dawn had shown its face. He turned to look at his mother, ready to say goodbye before he went out to find food. But something was different. Sarah lay motionless, completely motionless. Her chest rose and fell so faintly it was almost impossible to see. Her face was white as paper. Her lips bluish purple. Ethan felt a fear he had never known surge up inside him. He lunged to her side and shook her shoulder. "Mom. Mom, wake up." There was no response. Sarah didn't open her eyes. Ethan shook her harder, his voice starting to tremble. "Mom, wake up. Mom, I'm so scared. Mom." Sarah still didn't respond. Tears began to spill from Ethan's eyes. He sobbed, shaking his mother over and over. "Mom, don't leave me. Mom. Mom." At last, Sarah let out a faint groan. Her eyes cracked open, but her gaze was dull, as if she didn't truly see anything at all. She whispered so weak that Ethan had to lean close to hear. "I'm just tired, sweetheart. I'm fine." But Ethan knew she wasn't fine. He jumped to his feet and ran out of the unfinished building. He ran as fast as he could, cutting across streets and alleys toward Grace's restaurant. Tears streamed down his cheeks, mixing with sweat and road dust. He had only one thought in his head. Find Grace. Grace will help Mom. When Ethan reached the restaurant, Grace was opening the door, preparing for a new day of work. She saw the boy from a distance, his face flushed, his cheeks soaked with tears, and she immediately knew something was wrong. Ethan threw himself into Grace, clinging to her and sobbing. "Miss Grace, my mom can't get up. Please save her. Please save my mom." Grace didn't waste words. She grabbed Ethan's hand, hurriedly locked the restaurant, and ran with him to the unfinished building. When she saw Sarah, Grace's heart felt like it dropped into an abyss. Sarah lay there nearly unconscious, her breathing so weak it was barely there. Her skin was ashen, her lips dark purple. She was on the line between life and death. Grace's hands shook as she pulled out her phone and called for an ambulance. She knew an ambulance would cost money. She knew what little savings she had would vanish, but she didn't care. She couldn't let Sarah die. The ambulance arrived. The paramedics lifted Sarah onto a stretcher and carried her into the vehicle. Ethan and Grace went along, their hearts tight with fear. At the public hospital, the doctors moved quickly. They stabilized Sarah, then called Grace outside to speak with her. The doctor looked at Grace with a grave expression. "The patient has end-stage kidney failure. She's in critical condition. She needs a kidney transplant immediately. If not, she won't make it," Grace asked, her voice shaking. "How much will it cost?" The doctor sighed. "The transplant surgery plus the treatment afterward could cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. And that doesn't even include the process of finding a suitable kidney." Grace stood frozen, feeling as if someone had pulled all the air from her lungs. Hundreds of thousands of dollars. It was money she could never have, not even if she worked her whole life. She went back to the hospital room where Ethan sat beside his mother's bed, gripping Sarah's thin hand. The boy looked up at Grace, his eyes red and swollen from crying. "Miss Grace, is my mom going to be okay?" Grace tried to hold back her tears. She sat beside Ethan and pulled him into her arms. "I'll find a way. I promise. We'll find a way to save your mom." But deep inside, Grace knew it was a promise she didn't know how to keep. She was helpless. Completely helpless. After Sarah was admitted to the hospital, Grace couldn't let Ethan go back to the unfinished building alone. She brought the boy to her restaurant and cleared a small corner behind the kitchen for him to sleep. Every day she took Ethan to the hospital to see his mother, then brought him back to the restaurant again. Life moved forward like that, suspended in worry and waiting. Grace still opened the place every day. Still served customers, still tried to earn money. But her mind never stopped circling back to Sarah. To the staggering amount needed to save her life. To the dim and uncertain future hanging over Ethan and his mother. That morning, Grace opened the restaurant as usual. It was still early with only a few familiar regulars eating breakfast. Ethan sat in a corner, quietly staring out the window. He spoke less than before, and his eyes always carried a shadow of sadness. Grace wiped down tables while watching him, her heart aching. Everything felt ordinary and quiet until the roar of engines tore through the stillness. Grace lifted her head and looked out the window. Four glossy black SUVs had pulled up hard in front of her restaurant. These weren't ordinary vehicles. They were luxury SUVs with dark tinted windows, radiating threat and power. The customers inside went abruptly silent. They stared toward the door, faces draining pale with fear. In Chicago, everyone knew what black SUVs like that meant. The Mafia, the underworld, the kind of people you never wanted to cross. Car doors opened. 8 men stepped out, all in black suits and dark sunglasses. Their faces cold as ice, they lined up on both sides like guards, like statues set there to warn the world. Their eyes swept the street, taking in everything with the weary focus of predators. Grace stood frozen, her hand clamped around the dish towel, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it might split her ribs. She didn't understand what was happening. Why would people like this come to her tiny roadside place? What had she done wrong? Then the last door opened and one man stepped out. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a black suit cut to perfection. His black hair was slicked neatly back. His face was sharp and hard, stripped of expression. But it was his eyes that held everyone captive, deep-set and razor-cold. Carrying a kind of authority that made other people lower their gaze without even thinking. Nathan Cross. The name rang in Grace's head like an alarm bell. Who in Chicago didn't know Nathan Cross? The boss of the largest underground empire in the city? The man who controlled everything from the shadows. The man even the police treated with caution. The man whose slightest nod could decide another person's fate. Why would someone like Nathan Cross appear at her small restaurant? Grace couldn't understand it. Nathan walked inside, his men in black following behind. His steps were steady, heavy with command. With every step, the air inside the restaurant seemed to thicken, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Customers lowered their heads, not daring to look him in the eye. Grace wanted to lower her head, too, but she couldn't. She stood there, locked in place, watching the most powerful man in Chicago move toward her. But Nathan didn't look at Grace. His gaze swept the restaurant once, then stopped in the corner, stopped on Ethan. Nathan went still. For a heartbeat, his whole body seemed to turn to stone. He stared at the boy, eyes widening, his face struck with the look of someone seeing a ghost from his past. Those eyes, the boy's eyes, deep and clear, with a shape and color Nathan couldn't mistake. They were Sarah's eyes, the woman he loved, the woman he had lost 7 years ago. Nathan started toward Ethan, each step suddenly weighing like 1,000 pounds. The boy looked up at him, eyes wide with fear. Ethan had never seen anyone as terrifying as this man. He wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't listen. Nathan stopped in front of him and slowly lowered himself until he was level with the child. The distance between them closed down to only a few feet. Nathan's voice came out low and rough as if he were forcing something back down. "What's your name?" Ethan swallowed, his voice trembling. "My name is Ethan, sir." Nathan fell silent for a second, then asked again, his voice tighter now. "What's your mother's name?" Ethan answered, not understanding why this man was asking about his mother. "My mom's name is Sarah. Sarah Mitchell." The moment the name was spoken, Nathan straightened as if struck. He stepped back once, his face turning ashen like a man who'd just been hit by lightning. His hand shook, his eyes stayed locked on Ethan without blinking, as if he were trying to confirm something his mind refused to accept. Derek, Nathan's right-hand man, moved closer, watching his boss with concern. "Boss, are you okay?" Nathan didn't answer. He couldn't hear anything. He couldn't see anything except the boy in front of him. Sarah Mitchell, the woman he loved, the woman he believed he'd lost forever. She was alive. And this boy, with eyes exactly like hers, with the name Ethan, with features Nathan recognized as his own. This boy was his son. Nathan whipped around toward Grace, his gaze so sharp it felt as if it could pierce straight through her. His voice dropped low and commanding, heavy with authority. "What do you know about this boy? Where is his mother?" Grace trembled under Nathan's stare. She had never stood before someone so frightening. But she thought of Ethan. She thought of Sarah, and she gathered every shred of courage she had left to answer. "Sir, Ethan's mother is named Sarah. She's in the public hospital. She has end-stage kidney failure and needs a transplant right away or she'll die. But the cost is too high. No one can pay it." Nathan stood there in silence. But inside him, a storm was roaring. Sarah, the woman he loved, the woman who had waited for him. She was dying in a hospital. And he hadn't even known. 7 years. 7 years of searching for her everywhere and finding nothing. And now she was here in this very city, fading away because she couldn't afford treatment. Nathan turned to Derek, his voice cold as ice and utterly decisive. "Get the cars ready. We're going to that hospital right now." Derek nodded and immediately signaled the others. Nathan looked down at Ethan. His voice softened just a fraction, but the urgency still pressed through every word. "You're coming with me. We're going to see your mom." Ethan stared up at Nathan, fear and confusion filling his eyes. He didn't understand what was happening. Why did this terrifying man want to take him to his mother? Who was he? Grace stepped forward, placing herself in front of Ethan as if to shield him. She met Nathan's eyes, her voice trembling but firm. I'm coming too. I can't let Ethan go alone with you. Nathan studied Grace for a long moment. In her, he saw a kind of courage few people ever dared to show in front of him. At last, he nodded. Fine, get in the car. They stepped outside. Nathan lifted Ethan up and placed him into the first SUV. Grace climbed in after him. Nathan slid into the seat beside them while Derek took the front passenger seat. Before the vehicle moved, Nathan gave Derek an order over the phone. Send people to the public hospital immediately. Lock down the entire area. No one gets close without my permission. The convoy of 4 black SUVs tore through the streets of Chicago. They ran red lights, cut through traffic, moving like hunting beasts charging toward prey. No one dared to block them. No one dared to interfere. This was Nathan Cross's convoy. And everyone knew what that meant. When the vehicles brake hard in front of the public hospital, everything seemed to freeze. Patients, nurses, doctors, all of them stopped and stared. Shining black SUVs, men in black suits with cold faces, and Nathan Cross stepping out of the car with the presence of a king. They entered the hospital. Security moved to stop them. But the moment they recognized Nathan, they stepped aside. Doctors and nurses pressed back against the walls of the hallway, heads lowered, not daring to meet his eyes. Everyone knew who Nathan Cross was. Everyone knew it was foolish to make trouble with him. Nathan asked a nurse, his voice flat and icy. Where is Sarah Mitchell's room? The nurse shook as she pointed the way. Nathan walked on, Grace and Ethan following behind. Derek and the others posted themselves along the corridor like a living wall. When they reached the door to the room, Nathan stopped. He stood there for a moment, looking through the small pane of glass into the room, and he saw her. Sarah lay on the hospital bed, thin and pale, ivy lines running into her arm. She was no longer the young, beautiful woman he remembered. Illness and a hard life had taken everything. But to Nathan, she was still his Sarah, still the woman he loved more than anyone in the world. Nathan pushed the door open and stepped inside. His footsteps were gentle, as if he were afraid of startling her. He moved to the bedside and looked down at Sarah's pallid face. Pain clenched his heart as if someone had closed a fist around it. Sarah seemed to sense someone near. She slowly opened her eyes. The sickness had clouded them, and she blinked a few times, struggling to focus on the figure in front of her. And when she finally saw clearly, she went still. That face, those eyes, that man. It couldn't be Nathan. Sarah's voice was faint, like a whisper, as though she didn't dare believe what she was seeing. Nathan dropped to his knees beside the bed and took her bony hand in his. The hand that had once been strong and capable now shook. The eyes that had once been cold and razor-sharp were now wet and reining. It's me, Sarah. I'm here. I found you. Tears began to slide down Sarah's cheeks. 7 years of suffering, 7 years of waiting, 7 years of asking herself why he had abandoned her. All of it broke open in those tears. Why, she asked, her voice choking. Why did you leave me? I waited for you. I called you hundreds of times. Why didn't you answer? Why did you disappear? Nathan tightened his grip on her hand, his voice thick with pain. I didn't leave you, Sarah. They took me. Victor Salazar took me and kept me locked away for 3 years. I was tortured, trapped in darkness. I couldn't contact anyone. When I finally got out, you were gone. I looked for you everywhere, but you weren't in the old apartment. The bakery was closed. No one knew where you were. Sarah stared at Nathan, unable to believe what she was hearing. All those years, she had believed he betrayed her, abandoned her, and all that time he had been living through his own hell. Nathan, she sobbed, her weak hand trying to hold on to him. Nathan. At that moment, the hospital room door opened. Ethan ran in, his face drenched in tears. Mom. The boy rushed to the bed, climbed up, and threw his arms around Sarah. Mom, I missed you. Are you okay? Sarah held him and sobbed, her body shaking. My son, my precious son. Nathan stood and stepped back once. He watched mother and child cling to each other, crying, his heart flooded with emotion and with resolve. This was his family. The woman he loved and the child he had never known existed. He had lost them once. He would not lose them again, no matter what it took. Nathan didn't waste another second. He stepped out into the hallway, pulled out his phone, and called his personal physician immediately. Dr. Harrison was one of the best doctors in the United States, and he worked exclusively for Nathan for a salary few people could even imagine. The phone rang twice before it was answered. Nathan spoke in clipped phrases, his voice heavy with command. I need you at St. Mary Hospital right now. Arrange a private ambulance and contact the best private hospital in the city. I have a patient who needs an emergency transfer. End-stage kidney failure. You have 20 minutes. In less than half an hour, everything was in motion. A high-end ambulance stocked with the most advanced medical equipment pulled up to the entrance of the public hospital. Professional medical staff moved Sarah onto a stretcher with careful hands and transported her to the vehicle. Nathan walked beside her, never taking his eyes off her for even a second. Ethan and Grace were placed into another SUV, following behind the ambulance. The convoy sped through the night, heading toward the most luxurious private hospital in Chicago. When they arrived, Sarah was taken straight into a VIP emergency room. The room was spacious and spotless, filled with the most advanced medical technology. It was a world away from the underfunded public hospital where she had been lying only moments before. Top doctors were summoned in the middle of the night. They examined Sarah, held an urgent consultation, and delivered their conclusion. Dr. Harrison came to Nathan personally, his face grave. "Mr. Cross, the patient is in critical condition. She needs a kidney transplant immediately. She can't wait any longer. We are contacting the organ bank to find a suitable kidney, but this can take time, and time is something she doesn't have." Nathan stood there silent for a moment. Then he looked the doctor straight in the eye, his voice calm. "Absolute. Test me. I'll give her my kidney." Dr. Harrison froze as if he had misheard. "Mr. Cross, what did you say?" Nathan repeated himself cold and final. "I said, test me. If my kidney is a match, take it for her." Dr. Harrison stared at Nathan, shock plain on his face. He tried to explain, "Mr. Cross, this is major surgery. Donating a kidney carries risk, especially for a healthy man like you. You could have complications. It could affect your long-term health. I think you should consider this carefully before you decide." Nathan cut him off, his voice like ice. "I don't care about the risks. I don't care about complications. The woman in that room is dying. She needs a kidney. I have a kidney. Run the tests now." Dr. Harrison knew arguing with Nathan Cross was useless. He nodded and ordered the staff to begin. Nathan's blood was drawn and rushed to the lab for immediate analysis. An hour later, the results came back. Dr. Harrison read them, then looked up at Nathan. "Mr. Cross, your kidney is compatible with the patient. We can proceed with surgery." Nathan nodded without the slightest surprise, as if he had already known the answer, as if fate itself had arranged for him to be the one to save Sarah. "Prepare the operating room," he ordered. "Do it tonight." Before the surgery began, Nathan went into Sarah's room. She had been told about his decision, and her face was wet with tears. When she saw Nathan step in, Sarah reached toward him. "Nathan, don't," she said, her voice weak, but pleading. "Don't do this. It's dangerous. I don't want anything to happen to you because of me. I'd rather die than have you take that risk." Nathan sat beside her bed and took her hand. He looked into her eyes, the eyes he had acted for through 7 long years. "I already lost you once, Sarah," he said, his voice deep and full of feeling. "For 7 years, I lived in hell, not knowing where you were, not knowing if you were even alive. For 7 years, I punished myself for failing to protect you. Now that I found you, I won't lose you again. Even if I have to trade anything for it, 1 kidney is nothing compared to getting to see you live." Sarah sobbed, gripping Nathan's hand. He leaned down and kissed her forehead gently. "Everything's going to be all right," he whispered. "Just sleep. When you wake up, we'll start over from the beginning. I promise." Then Nathan stood and walked out of the room. He followed the doctors into the surgical prep area without looking back once. Inside him, there was no fear, only resolve. He would save Sarah no matter what price he had to pay. The surgery began at midnight. The lights in the operating room blazed bright and doctors and nurses in green surgical scrubs moved quickly, preparing everything for a major operation that would last for hours. Nathan lay on the operating table, his eyes fixed on the ceiling as the anesthesia began to take hold. The last thought in his mind was the image of Sarah and Ethan, his family, the people he would protect at any cost. Outside the operating room in the waiting area, Grace and Ethan sat on a white bench. The room was so quiet it felt suffocating. Fluorescent lights shone down with a cold clinical glare. The ticking of the wall clock sounded steady and relentless, as if reminding them of every second slipping away. Grace held Ethan's hand tightly, their fingers woven together as if searching for comfort. She closed her eyes and prayed silently for the surgery to succeed. She didn't belong to any faith, but in moments like this, she believed some higher power must be listening. "Please save them. Please let them live." Derek stood guard just outside the waiting room door. He was Nathan's right-hand man, the most loyal man in the underground empire Nathan had built. The phone in his pocket rang again and again. Work was still waiting. The empire was still running. There were hundreds of things that needed Nathan's decision. But Derek didn't answer. He only stood there, eyes fixed on the operating room doors, waiting if anything happened to his boss. He didn't know what he would do. Nathan wasn't only Derek's boss. He was the man who had saved Derek's life. The man who had given him a new life. The man Derek would die to protect. Time dragged, slow and heavy. 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours. The waiting room remained silent as stone. Grace couldn't sleep. Ethan couldn't sleep either. The boy sat curled close to Grace, his eyes locked on the operating room door. After hours of silence, Ethan suddenly asked, his voice small and full of worry. "Miss Grace, is my mom going to be okay? And that man too, is he going to be okay?" Grace turned to him. Ethan's eyes were red from lack of sleep and fear. She pulled him into her arms and gently smoothed his messy hair. "Your mom will be okay," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "And he will be okay, too. We have to believe that, Ethan. We have to believe everything will turn out all right." Ethan nodded and pressed his face into Grace's chest. He didn't cry. He was silent, but his whole body trembled. He was afraid. Afraid of losing his mother. Afraid that the strange man might be hurt as well. Even though he didn't understand why that man was helping his mother, he was grateful. Grateful beyond words. And then, at last, after nearly 6 hours, the operating room doors opened. Dr. Harrison stepped out, still in surgical scrubs, his face exhausted, but his eyes bright. Grace sprang to her feet, her heart pounding. Ethan stood too, gripping her hand tightly. Derek moved closer, waiting. Dr. Harrison looked at them, then gave a small smile. "The surgery was successful," he said, relief in his voice. "Sarah has received the new kidney. Her body is responding well, and Mr. Cross is recovering in the post-op unit. Both of them are stable." Grace felt her legs nearly give out. She wrapped Ethan in a fierce embrace, tears streaming down her face. Ethan lifted his head and looked at her, eyes wide. "My mom is going to live, Miss Grace?" he asked, his voice shaking as if he couldn't quite believe what he had heard. Grace nodded, smiling through her tears. "Yes, sweetheart. Your mom is going to live. She's going to get better." Ethan broke down, crying. Not from sadness, but from joy, from relief, from the feeling that at last the heavens had shown mercy to the two of them. His mother would live. His mother wouldn't leave him alone anymore. After the surgery, Nathan was transferred to a private recovery room. The room was spacious and quiet, filled with modern medical equipment that tracked every one of his vital signs. Nathan lay on the bed, his body worn out after a major operation that had lasted for hours. The incision along his side still throbbed with pain. The medication made his thoughts slow and foggy, but he didn't care about himself. The first thought that came when he woke was Sarah. Was she all right? Had the surgery worked? He wanted to get up, wanted to go to her room, but his body wouldn't allow it. All he could do was lie there and wait for news. The door swung open. Derek stepped in, his face tight, his eyes filled with worry. Nathan knew instantly something was wrong. He had known Derek long enough to understand that his right-hand man never looked worried unless the problem was serious. Derek came to Nathan's bedside, his voice low. "Boss, we've got trouble. Victor Salazar knows." Nathan opened his eyes and looked straight at Derek. "Knows what?" Derek swallowed as if bracing himself to deliver bad news. "He knows about the woman and the child. He knows they matter to you." At the sound of the name Victor Salazar, Nathan felt his blood begin to boil. It was the name he hated most in the world. It belonged to his mortal enemy. It belonged to the devil who had tormented him for 3 years in hell. 7 years earlier, when Nathan was still building his empire, Victor Salazar had been the most powerful boss in Chicago. He controlled most of the underworld. From smuggling to gambling, from protection rackets to loan sharking. Nathan was a rising newcomer then, trying to carve out territory of his own. Victor saw Nathan as a threat that needed to be eliminated. He ordered Nathan kidnapped, locked him in a dark underground cell, and tortured him for 3 years. Victor wanted Nathan to submit, wanted him to hand over everything he knew about his network, wanted him to kneel and beg for his life. But Nathan never submitted. Even when he was beaten, even when he was starved, even when he was tortured in the most brutal ways imaginable, he never gave up a single word. He endured. He waited. And in the end, after 3 years, he found a chance to escape. When Nathan escaped Victor's prison, he was no longer the young man he used to be. He became colder, more ruthless, stronger. He rebuilt his empire from the ashes, gathered the most loyal men around him, and step by step took Victor's territory. Now Nathan Cross was the most powerful boss in Chicago, and Victor Salazar was only a shadow of what he had been, stripped of most of his power, living on hatred and the hunger for revenge. Nathan looked at Derek, his voice like ice. "Where were his men seen?" Derek answered immediately. "Near this hospital. We've spotted at least 5 watching the area. He's planning something." Nathan forced himself to sit up despite the pain tearing at his incision. His face was hard as stone, his eyes sharp as blades. "How many men do we have here?" Derek replied, 20. "We're bringing more in." Nathan gave the order without hesitation. Double the guards around Sarah's room. No one gets within 30 m of Sarah and Ethan without my permission. Anyone suspicious? Grab them immediately. Derek nodded. Yes, boss. He turned and hurried out to carry out the order. Nathan lay back on the bed, but his mind wouldn't stop moving. Victor Salazar, that bastard, was back. He knew about Sarah and Ethan. He knew they were Nathan's weakness, and he wouldn't let this chance pass. Nathan's hand clenched into a fist. He had lost Sarah once because of Victor. He wouldn't let it happen again. Even if he had to kill them one by one, he would protect his family. That night, in Sarah's hospital room, Grace sat in the chair beside the bed. Ethan was curled up in her lap, asleep from exhaustion. Sarah was sleeping, too. Her breathing steadier than before. Everything looked peaceful, but Grace felt something was off. Suddenly, she heard noises outside. Quick footsteps, urgent voices over radios, doors opening and closing again and again. Grace gently eased Ethan down onto the chair, then went to the window. She looked out and her heart seemed to stop. Down in the hospital courtyard, dark figures were moving fast, men in black suits, radios in hand, running back and forth. They posted themselves at every corner, every entrance. It looked like they were preparing for a battle. Grace pulled Ethan close, fear tightening her arms. She didn't understand what was happening. Why were there so many men? Was something dangerous coming? The door to the room flew open. Grace startled and held Ethan tighter. But it was Derek who stepped in. He looked at Grace with a reassuring gaze. Don't worry, he said, his voice calm. No one can touch you or the boy. Those are my boss's orders. We'll protect you. Grace looked at Derek, then back out the window where the dark figures were still moving. She didn't understand everything that was happening. But she knew one thing. The man named Nathan Cross, even after a major surgery, was still protecting them, and that made her feel a little safer. The next morning, Nathan received a message, his phone vibrated, and the screen lit up with a single line from an unknown number. The mighty Nathan Cross has a weakness now. How sweet. Nathan read it, his face giving away nothing. But inside, fury flared like fire. Victor Salazar. That bastard dared to threaten his family. He summoned Derek to the room. When his right-hand man stepped in, Nathan said only one sentence. Take me to him. Derek froze, not believing what he'd heard. Boss, you just had surgery. You can't go out. The doctor said, you need to rest for at least 2 weeks. If you try to move around now, the wound could tear. It could get infected. It could be life-threatening. Nathan cut him off, his voice like ice. I said, take me to him right now. Derek looked at his boss and knew there was no changing this decision. He nodded and turned to make preparations. 15 minutes later, Nathan walked out of the hospital. Every step was agony, the incision at his side feeling as if it might split open, but his face remained cold, revealing not a trace of weakness. He climbed into a black SUV. Derek drove and the convoy began to move. They arrived at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. This was neutral territory, a place gangs often used to meet for negotiations. Nathan knew Victor would be here. He had sent the message to provoke him, and Nathan had come to answer. When the vehicle stopped, Nathan opened the door and stepped out. Derek moved to follow, but Nathan raised a hand to stop him. Stay here. I'm going in alone. Derek wanted to protest, but Nathan's eyes silenced him. Nathan walked into the warehouse alone. Carrying no weapon, he moved slowly, each step steady, even as his body screamed with pain. He would not let anyone see weakness. Especially not his enemy. Inside the warehouse, Victor Salazar was already waiting. He sat on an old chair surrounded by 10 gunmen, all of them holding weapons at the ready. When he saw Nathan enter, Victor's mouth curved into a vicious smile. You look weak, Nathan, Victor said, his tone mocking. Did the surgery not go well? I heard you donated a kidney to some woman. How touching. Nathan didn't answer. He simply stood there, staring straight into Victor's eyes, cold, sharp, without a hint of fear. His silence irritated Victor. Victor stood and moved closer. You sent men to watch my family, Nathan finally said, his voice low and threatening. Victor laughed loudly. Family? So, it's true. The cold-blooded Nathan Cross finally has a woman and a child. Who would have thought? A man who kills without blinking, and now he's soft. Nathan took one more step toward Victor. His gaze like it could burn the enemy to ash. Touch them and I'll burn everything you have into dust. Victor snorted, not looking afraid. You don't have the right to threaten me, Nathan. Look at you. You can barely stand. 10 guns are pointed at you. What do you think you can do? Nathan didn't answer. He only smiled. A smile so cold it was frightening. Then he said in a voice as calm as if he were talking about the weather. Look outside. Victor frowned and signaled one of his men to check. The man ran to the door, looked out, and his face went pale. He turned back, voice shaking. Boss, there are at least 50 SUVs outside. Hundreds of men, all armed. They've surrounded the entire warehouse. Victor rushed to a window and looked out, and he saw it. 50 glossy black SUVs parked in a ring around the warehouse. Hundreds of men in black suits stood outside, weapons in hand, ready to fight. This was Nathan Cross's army. This was the true power of the largest underground empire in Chicago. Victor's face blanched. He turned to Nathan. And for the first time, there was fear in his eyes. Nathan stepped closer, his voice like ice. While you were playing childish games, I built my empire. I have more men than you, more money than you, more power than you by 100 times. You are nothing, Victor. You're an ant trying to challenge an elephant. Victor stood there in silence. For the first time in his life, he didn't know what to say. Nathan turned and walked toward the door. Before he left, he stopped without looking back. This is my only warning. Next time, there won't be a conversation. Then he walked out, leaving Victor and his men standing there in fear. Derek was waiting outside. When he saw Nathan, he opened the car door immediately. Nathan climbed in and sat in the back seat. The door shut and the convoy began to move, leaving the warehouse behind. On the way back to the hospital, Nathan sat in silence. On the outside, he still looked cold and strong, but inside he was spent. The incision burned with brutal pain. Cold sweat broke across his forehead. His hands trembled, but he didn't let anyone see it. When they reached the hospital, Nathan stepped out and walked inside with steady footsteps. But the moment the door to his private room closed behind him, he collapsed onto the bed. He lay there breathing hard, hurting, exhausted. And yet, his lips curved into a faint smile. His family was safe. Sarah was safe. Ethan was safe. That was all that mattered. No matter what price he had to pay, he would protect them. The days that followed passed in peace. Nathan and Sarah remained in the hospital, each in a private room, recovering side by side from the major surgery. Sarah's health improved noticeably with every day that went by. The new kidney was working well, color returning to her skin. Her eyes no longer sunk in the way they had been. She could sit up now. She could eat normally. She could smile without pain tugging at the edges of it. Nathan recovered quickly as well. Even though the incision still hurt, his powerful body was healing a little more each day. The doctor said he was lucky his conditioning was so strong because getting out of bed that soon could have caused serious consequences otherwise. Ethan visited his mother and Nathan every day. The boy was like a small beam of light spilling into the hospital room. He drew pictures for his mother, messy childlike sketches of a house, trees, and 3 people holding hands. He told Nathan about what he saw in the hospital, about kind nurses, about the good food Miss Grace brought. Nathan sat and listened, the coldness in his eyes softening each time he looked at the boy. This was his son, his blood, the child he had never known about for 6 years. One evening, after Ethan had fallen asleep in Grace's room, Sarah asked to see Nathan. A nurse brought her in a wheelchair to his room. They sat facing each other by the window, the city lights glittering in the distance. Sarah looked at Nathan, her eyes filled with questions that had never been answered. "Who are you, Nathan?" she asked, her voice gentle but firm. "Who are you really? Why do you have so many people protecting you? Why is everyone afraid of you? What have you been doing for the past 7 years?" Nathan was silent for a long time. He stared out the window into the thick black night of Chicago. Then he began to speak. His voice low and slow. "I'm a mafia boss, Sarah. I control most of the underworld in this city. Drugs, weapons, gambling, protection, it's all in my hands. People call me Nathan Cross. And that name makes all of Chicago tremble." Sarah listened without speaking, without shock, without disgust. She simply stayed quiet, waiting for him to continue. Nathan went on, 7 years ago, when I met you, I was just a newcomer. I was trying to build power of my own. And Victor Salazar was my biggest enemy. He had me kidnapped, kept me for 3 years in hell. I was tortured, starved, beaten every day. He wanted me to submit, but I never surrendered. In the end, I found a way out." Nathan paused and drew a deep breath. "When I got out, I wasn't the same man anymore. I became colder, more ruthless. I built my empire from the ashes, gathered the most loyal men, and took everything Victor once had. I became the most powerful boss in Chicago. But through all those years, I never stopped looking for you. I searched everywhere, but you had vanished. Someone else lived in the old apartment. The bakery was closed. No one knew where you went. I thought you'd left the city. Or worse," Nathan's voice thickened. "I had everything, Sarah. Power, money, people's fear. But for 7 years, I had nothing that truly mattered. Not until now. Not until I found you and Ethan." Sarah looked at Nathan, tears sliding quietly down her cheeks. She reached out and took his hand, the hand that had killed, that had given orders of destruction, now trembling in hers. I don't care who you are, Nathan, she said, her voice soft but certain. I don't care what you've done. I only care about one thing. You came back. You found us. That's all I need to know. Nathan looked at Sarah, his eyes wet. For the first time in 7 years, he felt accepted. Not for power, not for fear, but for the man he truly was. They sat there hand in hand, watching the Chicago night. No more words were needed. Being together was enough. After nearly 3 weeks in the hospital, Nathan and Sarah were finally discharged. Dr. Harrison performed a last examination and confirmed that both of them had recovered well. Sarah's new kidney was functioning perfectly and her body had regained its strength. Nathan's wound had healed too, his health almost fully restored. When Sarah stepped out of the hospital, she could hardly believe she was walking on her own 2 feet. For the past 2 years, she had almost been unable to stand, unable to move, confined to lying still, and waiting to die. Now she was walking. She was breathing clean air. She was seeing sunlight again. All of it was because of Nathan, the man who had given her a second life. A convoy of glossy black SUVs was already waiting outside. Nathan helped Sarah into the vehicle and they began to move. The convoy left the hospital, traveled through Chicago streets and headed north. The farther they went, the more the scenery changed. From ordinary neighborhoods, they entered wealthy areas where grand mansions hid behind tall fences and thick trees. At last, the convoy stopped before a massive iron gate. The gate slowly opened, and Sarah's mouth fell open at what she saw beyond it. A sprawling mansion, larger than any home she had ever laid eyes on. Vast grounds with lush green lawns and bright flower beds. A marble fountain standing at the center of the drive, and the main house, a 3-story castle in classical European style, imposing and magnificent. Everywhere on the property, men in black suits stood guard. At the gate, in the yard, on the balconies, at every corner where eyes could reach. This wasn't just a home. It was a fortress under strict protection. Sarah looked at Nathan, still stunned. Is this your house? Nathan nodded, a faint smile touching his mouth. This is our home. The car stopped at the front entrance. Nathan got out first, then offered his hand to help Sarah down. They had barely stepped onto the front steps when the large doors flew open. A small figure shot out like a bullet. Mom. Ethan ran straight into Sarah's arms. The boy clung to her and sobbed. Mom, you can walk now. You're better. I missed you so much. Sarah sank to her knees and gathered him close. Tears streamed down her face. Yes, sweetheart. I can walk now. I'm better. I'll never leave you again. They held each other for a long time, mother and son crying with happiness. Grace stood in the doorway watching, her own eyes shining with tears. She had cared for Ethan the whole time Sarah was in the hospital, and she loved him like her own child. Now seeing them reunited, she felt a deep and overflowing joy. Nathan stood nearby, silently watching. He looked at Sarah and Ethan, emotion filling him. This was his family, the woman he loved, and the child he had never known existed. Now they were here inside his home, safe and happy. After the emotion settled, Sarah rose. She looked at Ethan, then at Nathan. She knew it was time to speak the truth. Holding Ethan's hand, she led him inside. They sat down on the sofa in the vast living room. Nathan sat across from them. Grace stood in the corner, quietly watching. Ethan, I have something I need to tell you, Sarah began, her voice gentle but serious. Look at Nathan here. He's the one who saved me. He gave me his kidney so I could live. Ethan nodded, looking at Nathan with grateful eyes. I know. Thank you so much. Sarah drew a deep breath, then continued. But there's one more thing I have to tell you. Nathan isn't only the man who saved me. He's someone very special to you. Ethan tilted his head, not understanding. Special how? Sarah looked at him, her eyes full of love and emotion. Ethan. Nathan is your father. The room fell into silence. Ethan sat there, eyes wide, mouth parted. He looked at Sarah, then at Nathan, then back at Sarah. He couldn't believe what he had just heard. My father, the boy whispered, his voice trembling. He's really my father, Mom. Nathan stood and walked to Ethan. He knelt in front of the boy until he was eye level with his son. His eyes, the eyes that had once been cold and sharp, were gentle now, filled with love. That's right, Ethan, Nathan said, his voice thick. I'm your father. I'm sorry I wasn't there for you these past 6 years. I'm sorry I didn't know you existed, but I promise you, from today on, I'll always be here. I will never leave you and your mother again. No one will be able to hurt you or your mom. I'll protect you both with my whole life. Ethan stared at Nathan, his eyes raining with tears. For 6 years, he had always wondered who his father was. Why he didn't have a father like other children. Why his mother always looked sad whenever he asked about his father. Now he had an answer. His father was here right in front of him. The man who had saved his mother. The man who had given his mother life. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Then the boy slowly smiled. A pure innocent smile full of happiness. "Yes, Dad," he said, his voice small but sincere. "I'm so happy I have a dad." Nathan couldn't hold back anymore. He pulled Ethan into his arms and held him tight. Tears streamed down his face. For the first time in 7 years, Nathan Cross, the most feared Mafia boss in Chicago, cried not from pain, not from anger, but from happiness. Sarah watched father and son holding each other and her tears fell too. Grace stood in the corner, crying without sound. It was a moment she knew she would never forget. The moment a family was reunited after 7 years apart, the moment love conquered everything. A few days after the family was reunited, Nathan asked Grace to come to his office for a private conversation. The room was expansive with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, an oak desk, and tall windows that looked out over a lush green garden. Grace stepped inside, a little uneasy, unsure what Nathan wanted to say. She had been in this mansion for weeks, caring for Ethan while Sarah was in the hospital. Now that everything had settled, she thought perhaps it was time for her to leave, to return to her ordinary life, to her small restaurant. Nathan stood by the window with his back to her. When he heard her footsteps, he turned. His eyes were no longer cold the way they had been the first time she met him. Instead, his gaze was warm, filled with gratitude. "You took care of my son when I couldn't," Nathan said, his voice low and sincere. "You saved him. You saved Sarah. I owe you everything." Grace shook her head, suddenly shy under his thanks. "I only did what anyone would do. I saw a hungry child and I fed him. It wasn't a big deal." Nathan stepped closer, looking her straight in the eyes. "No, not everyone would do that. You know it. Ethan begged everywhere before he met you. No one helped him. No one even looked at him. Only you did. Only someone with a heart like yours could do what you did." Grace fell silent, not knowing what to say. She wasn't used to praise like that. All her life, she had been used to taking care of herself, never expecting help or recognition from anyone. Nathan sat down and gestured for Grace to sit across from him. "Tell me about you, Grace. Who are you? What has your life been like?" Grace hesitated, then began to speak. She told him she had been orphaned as a child, that she didn't know who her parents were. She grew up in an orphanage where meals were never quite enough and warmth was never quite steady. When she turned 18, she left and stepped into the world with nothing but her own 2 hands. She did every kind of job to survive. Washing dishes in restaurants, waiting tables in cafes, cleaning in hotels. Any work that brought in money, she did it. She saved every dollar, every cent for years and years. In the end, she managed to save enough to open a small place of her own, Grace's Kitchen. That was everything she had. Nathan listened without interrupting. When Grace finished, he asked, "And what about your dreams? Do you have any dreams?" Grace gave a sad smile and looked down at her hands. "I've always wanted to go to college," she said, her voice soft, as if she were sharing a secret. "I want a degree, a better future, but tuition is too expensive. I could never afford it. It's just a dream." Nathan looked at Grace, his eyes brightening. "Dreams can become real, Grace," he said, meaning deepening in his tone. "Trust me." Grace didn't understand what he meant, but she didn't ask. She stood ready to leave the office. When Nathan called after her tomorrow, "Be ready to go with me. There's something I want to show you." The next morning, Nathan picked Grace up. They drove through Chicago and arrived at a high-end apartment building downtown. Nathan led Grace into the elevator up to the 15th floor and stopped in front of an apartment door. He took out a key, opened it, then stepped aside so Grace could see inside. Grace's mouth fell open. The apartment was spacious and bright with large glass windows overlooking the city. The furnishings were modern and elegant, from a cream-colored leather sofa to a glass dining table. The kitchen was fully equipped with brand-new appliances. The bedroom held a large bed dressed in crisp white linens. "This is yours," Nathan said, placing the key in Grace's hand. "This apartment is yours. You don't have to live in that small, cramped room anymore." Grace stood frozen, unable to believe what she was hearing. She looked at Nathan, then at the apartment, then back at Nathan. "I can't accept this," she stammered. "It's too much. I don't deserve it." Nathan shook his head. "You deserve it more than anyone I know." A week later, Nathan took Grace out again. This time, they drove to a busy street in the commercial district. The car stopped in front of a large building with a gleaming glass frontage. Above it hung a brand new sign with bold letters. "Grace's Kitchen." Grace stepped out of the car, looked up at the sign, then looked inside. It was a real restaurant, not her little roadside place. A polished upscale restaurant with dozens of tables, a modern kitchen, and a staff in uniform waiting inside. "I hired people to run this restaurant while you're in school," Nathan said, standing beside her. "The profits will be yours. You only need to focus on your education." Grace turned to Nathan, tears already starting to fall. "Is this real?" she asked, her voice trembling. This isn't a dream, is it? Nathan smiled, then handed Grace an envelope. She opened it, and her heart seemed to stop. It was an acceptance letter from one of the best universities in Chicago. Her name was printed clearly on it. Grace Turner, first-year student. Your future is waiting for you, Grace, Nathan said, his voice warm. You gave my son food when he was hungry. You gave him hope when he was desperate. You saved my family. This is how I thank you. This is how I repay your kindness. Grace couldn't speak. She only stood there, clutching the acceptance letter to her chest, sobbing. All her life, she had never dared to dream of things like this. Now the dream had become real, and it had all begun with a small act, feeding a hungry child a single meal. A few weeks later, when everything had finally settled, Nathan decided to do what he had been holding in his heart for a long time. One peaceful evening in the mansion, after a warm family dinner, Nathan led Sarah out to the back garden. Soft golden lights traced the cobblestone path leading to the fountain. Roses bloomed on either side, spilling their fragrance into the night air. Ethan was playing inside with Grace, giving the two of them privacy. Sarah didn't know what Nathan was planning. She was simply savoring the quiet moment beside the man she loved. They stopped by the fountain, the sound of water murmuring like a gentle song. Nathan turned to Sarah, his eyes full of love and sincerity. Then, slowly, he lowered himself onto one knee. Sarah's mouth fell open, her heart stumbling wildly in her chest. Nathan reached into his jacket and pulled out a small velvet box, opening it. Inside was a diamond ring sparkling beneath the light. I already lost you once, Nathan said, his voice deep and full of feeling. I won't make that mistake again. Sarah, will you marry me? Sarah stood there with tears spilling down her face. 7 years earlier, she had dreamed of this moment and then she had lost everything. She had believed she would never again be loved like that. Now the dream was turning real in front of her. Yes, she said, her voice choked. Yes, Nathan, I will. Nathan Rose slid the ring onto Sarah's finger and pulled her into his arms. They kissed under the moonlight, surrounded by blooming roses. Suddenly, a delighted shout rang out behind them. Mom and Dad are getting married. Ethan came running into the garden, his face shining. Behind him was Grace, smiling with happiness. The boy had been peeking through the window the whole time. Ethan threw his arms around both his parents, and the three of them stood there holding each other, laughing and crying at once. The wedding was held 2 months later. It was a grand, elegant ceremony, yet kept discreet for security reasons. Only the closest people were invited. The venue was a private resort outside the city, guarded tightly by Nathan's men. Grace was the maid of honor, wearing a pastel pink dress, standing beside Sarah throughout the ceremony. Ethan was the ring-bearer, dressed in a small suit just like his father's, walking solemnly down the red carpet aisle with a velvet pillow holding the 2 wedding rings. Nathan stood at the altar in a black suit, looking more polished and powerful than ever. But when Sarah appeared in a pure white wedding gown, his eyes held only tenderness. She looked like an angel. They exchanged vows. Nathan vowed to love, protect, and cherish Sarah for the rest of his life. Sarah vowed to stand by Nathan in happiness and in hardship, in wealth and in poverty until death parted them. When they exchanged rings and kissed, the entire room applauded. Ethan jumped with joy. Grace wiped away tears of happiness. After the wedding, when the first night as husband and wife had passed, Nathan sat down with Sarah for a serious conversation. I want to take you and Ethan overseas, Nathan said, his voice firm with resolve. Somewhere safe, somewhere no one from my world can ever reach you. Sarah looked at her husband, surprised. And what about your empire? Nathan gave a faint smile. Dererick will manage everything here. I trust him, and you and Ethan matter more than any empire. I've lived for power too long. Now I want to live for my family. Sarah took Nathan's hand and nodded. She understood this decision wasn't easy for him, giving up everything he had built over 7 years. Yet, he was willing to do it for her and their son. They prepared documents and arranged everything. On the day they left, Grace came to see them off at the private airport. She hugged Sarah tightly, tears running down her face. Stay in touch, Grace said. I'm going to miss you and Ethan so much. Sarah nodded, crying, too. Thank you, Grace. Thank you for everything. Ethan hugged Grace, not wanting to let go. Miss Grace, I'm going to miss you. Grace bent down and kissed the boy's forehead. I'm going to miss you, too. Study hard, okay? Nathan shook Grace's hand, gratitude in his eyes. You'll always be part of this family, Grace. Anytime you need anything, just call. Then they boarded the private jet. The door closed. The engines roared. The plane lifted into the blue sky, carrying Nathan's family toward a new land, a new life, a new future. Grace stayed in Chicago and began a new chapter of her life. Grace's kitchen grew stronger and stronger, becoming one of the most beloved places to eat in the area. Her staff worked hard, customers filled the dining room every day, and the revenue climbed steadily. Alongside the business, Grace was also attending college. Step by step, turning into reality, a dream she had once believed she would never be able to reach. One morning, Grace stood inside her own elegant restaurant and looked out through the large glass window. Outside, the city of Chicago moved in its constant rhythm, people flowing past in both directions. She glanced down to the sidewalk where a small wooden chair sat just outside the restaurant, and she remembered. She remembered the thin little boy in torn old clothes sitting alone on that chair. She remembered those clear eyes, hope and desperation woven together in them. She remembered the soft question he had asked her. "Could I please have another portion to take home for my mom?" Grace smiled, her eyes filling with tears. She whispered to herself. All it takes is one small act of kindness. Just that and everything can change. This story reminds us of something deeply important. One small act of kindness can change an entire life. One moment of love can save a shattered heart. And one helping hand can lift a family from suffering into happiness. Grace never knew that feeding a hungry child a single meal would open the door to miracles. But that is the power of kindness. It never disappears. It always finds its way back. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but it will come back with blessings beyond imagination. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button and share this video with the people you love. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss emotional stories every day. How did this story make you feel? Did it remind you of anything in real life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We truly want to hear what's in your heart. Thank you for watching. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace and happiness. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.